Good evening, everyone, and welcome, or good morning to some of you, and welcome to our very special Global Executive Panel brought to you by the Victorian Local Governance Association and LGiU on the topic of child-friendly cities and communities and the impact of COVID on children and young people. I'll introduce you to our panel and guests in just a moment, but firstly, on behalf of the VLGA, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Victoria, throughout Australia, and wherever people are joining us this evening, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to the traditional owners, their elders, past, present and future, and to their cultures. We're very, very pleased to see people coming in from all over Australia. In fact, we have representatives registered this evening from almost every state, I think, except for Western Australia. Of course, they're on a different time zone as well. And we've got lots of people from the UK and from Ireland this evening. Before we go any further, I'd like to introduce the CEO of the VLGA to say a few words of welcome, Kathryn Arndt, who's fresh back from a well-earned rest. Great to see you looking rested, Kathryn. Good evening to you.
Good evening, Chris, and good morning to those who are joining us from the UK. It's just fantastic to be sitting here again with you, Chris, and also our partners, LGiU. And I do acknowledge, I think I saw Andy Johnson from LGiU based in the UK with us here. So it's terrific to be able to host yet another of our quarterly global panels, and it truly is becoming quite a global event when we look at the number of people joining us from all parts of the world, particularly the UK, Scotland, Ireland, and also Australia. It's such an important topic that we have to talk about tonight, and it's a great honour to have the esteemed panellists that we do, and I'll let Chris welcome each of those, but on behalf of the VLGA, I would like to acknowledge and thank Liana, Angela and also Vivian for their participation tonight. And as Victoria is about to head into another lockdown, and many parts of the world are still in lockdown, this is a continuing issue for our consideration and a most worthy discussion about how all parts of our society and our community are impacted. And tonight we're focusing on children and young people. For those who don't know, the VLGA, the Victorian Local Governance Association, is the peak local government body supporting good governance in the local government sector. There is no other organisation like us in Australia, and yes, we're based in Victoria, but our work certainly crosses borders when we look at the concept of what is good governance in an elected representative model, and how does that impact the services that we deliver to our community, and also what is, upholding the democratic principles that we all value. But on that note, I will hand back to Chris, and I look forward to the discussion. Please, as we go along, if you do have questions for the panellists, put those in the chat function, and we'll be monitoring those and hopefully getting to as many as we can. Of course, we may not be able to get to all of them, but we do welcome and encourage those questions to come through. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, and looking forward to getting lots of them coming through during the course of our session. So we have, we're really, really pleased to have a terrific panel to discuss this topic this evening and to take your questions. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Victoria's Commissioner for Children and Young People, Liana Buchannan, who I'll be speaking to very shortly. But Liana, good evening and welcome to you. We have Dr. Vivian Romero, who's a public health lecturer with Central Queensland University. And I assumed she was in Queensland, but she's actually joining us from Melbourne this evening, and we'll be chatting with Vivian very shortly as well. Thank you, Vivian, for joining us. To start, though, this evening, I'm really pleased to welcome from Aberdeen City Council in Scotland, the CEO, Angela Scott. Good evening to you, Angela. Angela's been with Aberdeen since late 2013 as originally Director of Corporate Governance, and has been in the chief executive role since July of 2014. She's got a very established and credentialed career in public service, and even more broadly than that, is currently a member of the National Suicide Leadership Group, a member of the National Children and Young People's Mental Health Delivery Board, a member of the National Child Protection Leadership Group, and a host of other roles that Angela performs. And we're going to find out tonight a bit about the Aberdeen journey to become part of the UN Convention on Children's Rights. I think very much a leadership journey in the UK. Angela's going to speak to a presentation for the next little bit, and then she'll be able to take your questions during the course of the evening. So Angela, good evening. And if you're happy to start speaking to your slides, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Chris. It does feel a bit like the Eurovision Song Contest, so I'm delighted to join you from Scotland, and I hope colleagues give me more than 0 points at the end of my presentation. Good morning and good evening to colleagues, and genuinely thank you for the opportunity to share with you Aberdeen's journey to embed children's rights and their voices in our system of public bodies at a local governance level. I also want to take the opportunity to share with you the legislative backdrop which has been provided by successive devolved governments here in Scotland over a period of time, and bring you right up to date with the incorporation of the UN Charter into Scots law, which is fantastic. This convergence, I think, between national and local government is absolutely critical in order to ensure equity across all Scotland's children, whilst also recognising that children and their families live their lives in local communities. Over a period of time, successive Scottish governments have been incorporating aspects of the UN Charter into Scots law. The Scottish courts have had regard to the Charter, and it's been quoted in court decisions. Some of the incorporation to date has gone further than the requirement of the Charter. So, for example, the Children's Scotland Act of 1995 requires the welfare of the child to be the paramount consideration, as opposed to best interests of child being a primary consideration. This slide does show the gradual but perhaps piecemeal incorporation of the Charter to date. The current Scottish Government has elected to fully incorporate the Charter into Scots law, and the bill was passed by the Scottish Parliament on the 16th of March 2021. It's been referred to the Supreme Court, and pending a ruling be a small number of aspects being out with the devolved powers of the Scottish Parliament, it is anticipated that the bill will receive royal assent. Public authorities across Scotland are preparing for a go-live from October of this year. In terms of the enforcements of rights under the UN, as you can see from this slide, the enforcement rights are considerable. A person who claims that a public authority has acted or proposes to act in a way that it's incompatible with the UN requirements may raise legal proceedings in any court or tribunal that has power to award the remedy sought, so a judicial review. It's also unlawful to act incompatibly with the UNCR requirements for anyone undertaking functions or providing services to children with public money. That also includes the entirety of my supply chain as a local authority as well. The court must, where practicable, give the child an opportunity to express a view about the effectiveness of any remedy that it's considering. And the court has the power to make a declaration that legislation is incompatible with the convention. So as you can see, quite considerable enforcement rights under this legislation. I didn't want to go through each one of these, but given Liana's participation today, I just wanted to highlight the power which has been given to Scotland's Commissioner, Scotland's equivalent of Liana, Commissioner for Children and Young People, who will now have the power to bring or intervene in proceedings if determined that a public authority has acted in a way incompatible with the Act. As I said in the beginning, I think it's really important, the convergence between national and local government. And I think the best person who sums that up is Eleanor Roosevelt. As you know, the absolute leader and champion of the introduction of human rights after World War II. And this quote, I think, summarises, the necessity for national and local government to work together. And she recognises in this quote, just as I'd said earlier, that children live their life at a local level. They live their daily lives in neighbourhoods and communities, not in our context, not at a subnational level of government. However, I do think that the legislative power, particularly for us in Scotland, of the national government and use of that legislative power, as you can see by the incorporation of the Charter into Scots law, will ensure an absolute equity of rights across all of Scotland's children, removing any prospect of a postcode lottery. But I do think it's vital that we have national government and local government coming together on this journey. So I wanted to just take a bit of time now to describe our journey here in Aberdeen, and the point at which we decided to pursue the accreditation as a set of multi-agency partners, and not just as a city council, and we may want to unpack that a bit in the Q&A, but that decision was the culmination of a significant journey that we had been on as a set of local leaders. That journey was centred on trying to arrive at a shared understanding of the needs of our local population, including children, and whether we could, as a collective set of public partners, coalesce around a set of outcomes which would express what shared success could look like for us. The prioritisation of place outcomes over institutional priorities, essentially using the place and the outcomes that we strive for to be our North Star, was a journey in my mind of understanding collective leadership versus institutional or organisational management. And as part of that journey, the development of trust within our personal relations as leaders of local government, NHS, police, fire, tertiary education, who have all signed up as part of this accreditation. That journey about developing trust has been critical. And why do I say that? I think it's because in my mind that trust has created for us an environment where we are jointly committing our organisations to the pursuit of 15 place outcomes, which includes the UNICEF accreditation. And it's created an environment of mutual accountability for the outcomes, not just the accountability of local government. These softer aspects of our leadership journey are difficult to adequately capture in a PowerPoint slide, and perhaps the panel Q&A will provide us with an opportunity to explore the leadership, which I think needs to sit behind the desire for UNICEF accreditation. So the Child Friendly Cities was a global initiative, and there was a 3-year pilot of the initiative in the UK called Child's Rights Partners. And the child rights-based approach brings together 7 principles based on the UNCR and general human rights. Each principle is significant and valuable in and of itself, but it's only when they're used together that we can say a rights-based approach has been taken. In Aberdeen City Council, we had adopted the UN Rights Respecting School programme, and we've got about 77% of our schools are participating. And our local health board colleagues had adopted the Baby Friendly initiative. So the Child's Right Partner programme was perhaps the next logical step for us. Remembering, of course, though, that the UNCR had not been incorporated into Scots law at that point that we were deciding as a local system to seek the accreditation. Given the breadth of children's rights as set out in the UNCR, as well as the wide range of responsibilities of not just the local authority, but of our partners, the Child Friendly programme employs a badge framework which allows councils and its partners to focus on defined areas of work during their partnership with UNICEF. As I said, the programme is underpinned by a range of badges, and there are 3 foundational badges that you must work towards, and these are yellow in the image, and 3 thematic badges that are chosen from a choice of 10. The thematic badges are heavily influenced by the views of children during the discovery phase, so in total you're working towards 6 badges. For our thematic badges, we chose participating, child-friendly services and plays. And in terms of why we chose those, and again, they were a product of discussion with young people, selecting the thematic badge on place tied into our work at a local level in terms of the development of a spatial plan for the city. And we've been very focused about how we could take a health and all policies approach to our spatial planning for the city. So again, it felt like a natural connection, and not only were we developing work on our spatial plan for the city, But the next stage of our development is to try and develop spatial plans at a locality level. And given the point that we made earlier, that children live their lives in localities and communities, again, being able to shape that environment that children live in on a daily basis felt like there was a natural connection there. And I have to say that my head of strategic place planning was totally converted to wanting to use the levers of planning not only to support important development in the city, but also to improve the lives of children. Our second badge that we elected was child-friendly services. And again, for partners, that tied in to a lot of work, which I'm sure you're also doing in terms of the redesign of your services and thinking about all of our customers, including children, how we can redesign our services, in part a fiscal response, but also the opportunity to really put our customers at the heart of our service redesign. So again, that chimed with partners. And the final badge that we elected was participating, and given the infrastructure, and it's quite considerable, that we put in place as a result of the Rights Respecting Schools programme and some other civic structures that we have in place within the city, partners felt that the infrastructure collectively could be utilised to help to bring the voice of children in a very robust and reliable way into our respective decision-making structures. So that's the rationale for the 3 badges that we chose. Some of the other badges, actually, we felt like we had been making really solid progress, and we wanted to take the opportunity of the accreditation to focus on the areas where we thought that we needed more work to do. Following all of that work, an action plan was created and agreed, which identifies the specific outcomes and activity that will enable us to progress with these areas. So there's a very clear journey in terms of working towards the accreditation, and just starting on the bottom right-hand side of this slide. What you see is what's referenced to as the discovery phase, again, in dialogue with young people and children. You have a discussion and a debate about what your badges could look like and the priorities for that. And as I said, we were able to use extensively the rights respecting infrastructure to make sure that we had the voice of children. So we had that advantage before we started this process. From the discovery phase, then you move to the development stage, which is the development of your action plan. And from your action plan, then you go into to progress your delivery, which broadly can take anywhere between 2 to 4 years. And then you move to your recognition, where there's an independent panel of experts that assess the partnership's progress and decide whether you achieve that accreditation. In a political environment, and I know that you'll recognise this, it's really important that once you achieve an accreditation of this nature, that you can never lose that accreditation. So the robustness of the process in advance of the recognition and the importance of being able to sustain the accreditation is a key factor to consider if you consider yourself trying to progress the accreditation. So this slide just says a wee bit more around the discovery and again what's required to be in place. Inevitably, in working with children, UNICEF are concerned around making sure that all the safeguarding arrangements are in place. And I think for us in the UK, with really strong, as I'm sure you are the same in Australia, very strong processes, practices in place around safeguarding children. So that for us, that was a relatively straightforward process to be able to demonstrate that aspect of it. And again, we found the second aspect in terms of the baseline, being able to demonstrate already how we had been accessing children's voice and so on. We actually had quite a strong baseline. And again, I would accredit that to the work that we've been doing as a system on the rights respecting school. And then, of course, the final part of the discovery is the communication plan. And again, just articulating how you're going to work together. Probably fair to say that, I mean, I think, and again, colleagues from UK will correct me, I think in total across the UK, there are 4 or 5 cities that are trying to progress the accreditation. So it's fair to say that I think across the 4 or 5 of us that we are being kind of pilots of what's been a global programme, which was largely focusing on developing countries. And I think in a developed context where the systems, the policies, the practice are very, very strong. I think there's been quite considerable learning for UNICEF in these partnerships, just around actually how much of this stage, the discovery phase, could potentially be more accelerated in the context of more developed countries. So again, just saying a wee bit more around the discovery, and they're very clear about the necessity for governance and a decision-making structure. Within Scotland, legislation requires us to have a structure called the Community Planning Partnership. Law requires the local authority to initiate and facilitate that community planning partnership. So my council leader actually chairs our planning partnership, and a whole range of bodies are identified in statute who are required to participate in the community planning partnership. So we asked the community planning partnership to collectively agree to work towards the accreditation, and the community planning partnership and its subgroup, the Integrated Children's Services Partnership Board, acts as our formal governance around the accreditation. So again, with some real strength to underpin that requirement. And again, just on that left-hand side, the requirement for youth participation and engagement. And again, I think we had a really good spectrum of structures that we were able to utilise. Okay, so this is the development of the action plan. And again, I think that our council leader was particularly interested in this action plan to make sure that what we were committing to we could all deliver, and thereafter the accreditation, that we would be able to sustain all of these actions. And that's important to bear in mind around life post your accreditation. So again, a kind of number of stages to work through in the development of the action plan. So this is largely where we're at now. We've been implementing the action plan. We continue to engage with UNICEF. Very helpfully, they're facilitating the 4 or 5 systems coming together. Newcastle is one of those. And so again, there's lots of learning exchange opportunity, and that's really interesting for us in the UK, because some of our national strategies and policies are very different north and south of the border. So we're gaining a lot through that facilitation from UNICEF. There is a rigorous requirement to submit your reporting on the progress that you're making. So we have to submit a 6-monthly report. Again, you've got to evidence the ongoing participation of children in that process. So the orange line is largely where we're at, and obviously things have been a bit impacted by COVID over the last 15 months, but we're making good progress. So ultimately you're seeking the accreditation. You have to submit evidence backed up, importantly, by testimony from young people, and that you are committing to the self-regulation. And again, in my earlier remarks, I spoke about how this was actually embedded in our 15 outcomes from the place. Our 15 outcomes get expressed, and again, statute in Scotland requires community planning partnerships to formulate what's referenced to as a local outcome improvement plan. That plan has to cover a 10-year period. Within Aberdeen's community planning partnership, we refresh that plan every 2 years. So the UNICEF accreditation has been in there right from the start. And that's where we will continue to self-regulate and monitor our own ongoing commitment. I don't think it's anything that we would ever stop, following the accreditation. But rigorous process that you have to rightly to submit to UNICEF in order to achieve the accreditation. So hopefully we in the city are well on our way to achieving that. Chris, that was about as much as I wanted to say on the kind of process of seeking the accreditation and what's involved. I did want to just kind of underscore that point about the leadership that needs to sit behind all of this, and would welcome colleagues if they want to pick any of those points up through the Q&A. But with that, Chris, I'll hand back to yourself.
Thank you very much, Angela. That's really exciting, and so much. I've got a list of questions, but I'm sure the people in our audience probably do as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if our other panelists have got some questions about all of that as well. And I'm going to come to, thank you, Angela. Take a breath, and we'll come back for some more discussion. I want to introduce Liana Buchannan, who is Victoria's Principal Commissioner for Children and Young People and has been since 2016. In her spare time, she's a part-time commissioner of the Victorian Law Reform Commission as well, and is, of course, no stranger to VLGA Connect. Lovely to see you again, Liana. Good evening and welcome.
Hello, Chris. Lovely to be here, and good evening or good morning to everybody online, depending where you are.
Now, what are your initial thoughts on what you've just heard in terms of the Aberdeen journey and comparing, the space that you're working in here?
Well, I'm jealous. It's as simple as that, and have indeed been watching the developments. So kind of hearing about the child-friendly city accreditation process has been fascinating. And also, as Angela started kind of talking about the process in Scotland of enshrining the Convention on the Rights of the Child into domestic law and making some of those rights enforceable, it's incredibly exciting. And I think, if we talk this evening or this morning a bit about what I've observed in terms of the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic on children, I just think if we had some of those structures in place, some of that focus in place, then I think we could have seen some very different approaches taken, some quite different decisions made at different points in time. So you're right, Chris. This panel member definitely wants to ask a question of Angela, and that's in part what it will be. But yes, in short, I'm jealous, and it's my hope. I mean, people who've heard me speak before will know that I have a view that, although over 30 years since Australia ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we really don't have it consistently embedded in any of the structures, in government, in decision making generally, in our psyche as a community. So the leadership that Angela's describing, both at the national level in Scotland and at the local government level, is impressive and inspiring.
Liana, you're not alone. I know our other panelist, Vivian, has already indicated to me that she's got a question she'd like to ask Angela as well. So we'll probably give you first dibs very shortly. But you've just talked about, your observations. Perhaps if you could summarise how you've felt children and young people have been impacted by what we've gone through in Victoria and in Australia more broadly in the last 18 months.
I'll talk quite specifically about Victoria, partly because that's where I'm based and that's my mandate, and that's where we've done the focused work. Also, as people certainly in Australia would know, particularly those of you who are joining from Victoria, we last year we experienced the most protracted lockdowns and the most significant, I think it's fair to say, restrictions. So we're just as of today heading into our fifth. And just for those of you from outside Australia, last year in 2020, we were in significant kind of hard lockdowns for at least 6 months. And certainly from a school point of view, our schools were closed and running remotely for the better part of 3 terms, so pretty significant. So in terms of what that meant for children and young people, some of our focus at the Commission for Children is on vulnerable children who have who are living in families doing it tough, in families that are already disadvantaged, marginalised, where there might be a whole raft of issues already playing out, sometimes conflict, violence, and so on. So our first focus was on those groups of children. And it's fair to say that the combination of those children suddenly not being visible outside of the home, whether it was to kindergarten or school or to the extended community or wider family networks, the combination of that with people in lockdown, significantly heightened stresses at home, people losing their jobs, adults being significantly affected in their own right. And thirdly, services, including services like child protection and other child and family services, really changing and effectively withdrawing what they did. The combination of those 3 meant a pretty poor set of consequences for many, many children and young people. So that was our first focus, and that was a consistent focus and concern around what was happening for children in families that were already doing it tough. Over the course of the first lockdown, even in the first part of last year, what we saw very quickly, and then as a commission embarked on engaging with and hearing from hundreds and hundreds of children and young people to test this was that actually the impacts of the pandemic and the restrictions went much, much broader than those children that you might have already had a degree of concern about in terms of what was happening for them. So we've done, as I say, consultations, engagement, surveys, now had surveys open throughout the period from mid last year onwards. And what we've overwhelmingly heard from children and young people is that the restrictions and indeed the cumulative effect of restrictions and lockdowns and uncertainty that comes with that is having a very, very negative effect on their mental health. We in our last lockdown in June, we kind of had a push on the survey in a 2-week period. We got hundreds of responses, and reading through the comments from children and young people, just the extent to which they're describing being isolated, overwhelmed, suffering anxiety, suffering depression, young people who had existing mental health concerns, having those very seriously exacerbated, and many, many others who hadn't had poor mental health before, experiencing really negative effects. So, I mean, I think it's fair to say in a nutshell, and there's lots more I could say, what I've seen and what I'm seeing increasingly as we continue to grapple with this pandemic is a very, very negative effect on children and young people, particularly negative effect in some ways on children and young people who are already disadvantaged in some way, but actually this impact goes much, much more broadly across the board.
There's nothing fair about this virus, of course, but I've heard some suggestions that the children in particular are unfairly burdened by the response measures that have been introduced to this, particularly as they're not eligible to get the vaccine. Is that a premise that you agree with?
Look, I definitely would point to the disproportionate or particular impacts on children and young people. And the unfairness part comes through actually from children and young people themselves. They say, hold on a minute, we are suffering in all of these ways. Our education is suffering, our mental health is suffering, the prospects of us going forward is being impacted. Our future is suddenly much, much less certain. And they recognise that some of that is about the pandemic and is no one's fault. But what they point to is that they don't have a say. They have no power. Not even any influence is their sense over the major decisions that are being made about how things are being handled and about the major impacts that then flow to them. So I think there's two parts to that, Chris, for me. One is the need for us to pay particular attention to the impact on children and young people and recognise that actually when you're looking at isolating people, disrupting children's connection, cutting them off from a whole range of services, schools being the obvious one, but many, many more, the impact of that can be incredibly severe and possibly more severe than the impact on adults. And then separately, you have this sense from children that, it's not fair because we are suffering and we're suffering in particular ways, and yet we have no say over it.
As we move in Melbourne, lockdown 5, and more broadly Victoria in lockdown 5, do you think the priorities now with that children and young people lens is any different now than it was last year? Like, have things become more stark in any particular way in your view?
I think the priorities for children are changing. If I look back at the responses that we were getting when we were engaging with children and young people before the pandemic, and then in the early days of the pandemic, what we're hearing more and more strongly, if I look at the last survey analysis that we did, children and young people are talking much more strongly about the need to try and keep schools open or keep more schools open if they can. And that's something, a year and a half ago, we wouldn't really have imagined hearing in many ways from children and young people. And as I say, it's grown. The strength of that has really grown in recent months. And with that last lockdown, 2-week lockdown that we had in particular, it really seemed to have brought back for many children and young people, as it did for adults, some of the hardest aspects of last year. More broadly, do I think the collective we, the decision makers, are changing the prioritization for children? I think it's very gradual. And I think, to be fair, to try and be fair, we are still all, government by government, decision maker by decision maker, trying to make the best decisions possible to manage the pandemic, to, in Victoria's case, contain the spread and come back to zero community transmission. All of that is very, very important. What I've struggled with is that I think it's taken us a long time. If I look at last year, for example, it took until towards the end of the year for us to actually pull out the research about how much children transmit the virus, how much risks there really are in a school setting. And I know some of that's changed with the new variants of the virus, but it took us until October to kind of really focus on, do we need to close schools in a blanket way? And then when we did that research, the Murdoch Children's Research Institute did that really credible research looking globally, and there were some different decisions made about what needed to happen. So what I'd like to see is us having a much more consistent approach to whatever decisions we're making, to kind of factoring children into that decision-making process. And I have to say, whether I'm thinking about the approach taken by child protection, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, or the approach to school closures, or a whole raft of other decisions, I just haven't seen children and the impact on children and young people high enough, not anywhere near high enough in the priority kind of list of what matters.
I might give you a moment to take a breath there, Liana. I do have more questions for you, and more importantly, there's some coming for you in the chat as well, which we'll get to very shortly. But I do need to bring in our third panel member to introduce and say a few words about her work. It's Dr. Vivian Romero, a public health lecturer with Central Queensland University. Vivian, thank you for being patient and welcome to the discussion.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I'm honored to be part of this panel.
Could you tell us a bit about the research that you've been doing around COVID and the impact, particularly on children's movement patterns, I think, is that correct?
I'm just going to do just a little bit of background to give the context for why I researched what I did. As all of you know, the World Health Organization recommends that children and young people between the ages of 5 to 17 should do at least about 60 minutes per day of moderate to vigorous exercise. So opportunities for physical activity generally occur through active transport to and from school, school recess, physical education, organized sports, and active play. In fact, studies have shown that walking and playing away from home can contribute to physical activity. And here in Australia, and my shameless plug, my focus has been on exploring this notion of active play as a means to contribute to children's healthy development, as well as adhering to Article 31 of the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, which recognizes children's rights to play and encourages the provision of appropriate and equal opportunities for cultural, artistic, recreational, leisure activity. But as you know, Corona, yeah. The preventative measures to flatten the curve, work, retail, school, park closures, stay-at-home orders. Basically, these measures restricted children and young people's opportunities to be physically active and have this active movement. So COVID stirred up the academics among us working from home to go figure what's going on and how did this affect physical activity. And Lisa Olive from Deakin University and colleagues analyzed data during the early stages of COVID-19 social restrictions and compared it to Australian pre-pandemic national data. And this is preprint, cutting edge stuff. Looking at about 24 parents across Australia, they found that physical activity, which includes walking and cycling, among parents went up. So parents significantly, statisticians take note, increased their participation at least 30 minutes of physical activity from 3 days to 4 days per week. So an extra day of movement. And in another study, about 1,600 children and young people 4 to 18 years, 52% were active in public space. In a smaller localized study, 157 children, there's a reported increase in the time and duration of active play. And this is all occurring during COVID. And what these last two studies magnify is that influence of public space, and talked about that renewed perspective and appreciation of outdoor places. And you think about this, and it started having me think, well, what are other things, what are acts that can encourage children, young people, and families to be active outside in these COVID times? So as an academic, I turned to that most significant measure, Instagram.
Well, of course, as you do.
and what I've done is that I tracked Instagram posts in Melbourne from January 2020 to December 2020 via the National News Network Instagram channel, ABC. And so consider it Australia's BBC, just to figure out what were families doing.
So what sort of observations or findings did you land on from researching in that way?
So emerging themes included sort of three specific areas: is reimagining space, reconnecting with neighbors, and playful invitations. And if I can just touch briefly on those three aspects. Yep. So about the theme of reimagining space, so we need to perceive motivating opportunities at people scale. And I loved what Angela had said that about children living life at the local level. And this is exactly it, especially during COVID times. And what my research has shown is that taking that cue from cyclovias and open streets, there was a post about this local group called the Wholesome Hour, which performed outdoor jazzercise sessions in their front yard, inviting people to come outside and exercise with them, socially distanced, of course, in the streets. Or transforming the street as an opportunity for active citizenship, whereby people, particularly the young people, unifying and identifying, in this case, protecting and respecting Indigenous people's rights. When we talk about that second theme of reconnecting with neighbors, there were a lot of posts about the power of the local and the spirit of kindness to motivate children, young people to walk, cycle, roller skate in their localities while being exposed to intergenerational connections. So there are things posts about inspired by those little free libraries and community pantries where sharing neighbors or bounty however great or small offered passerbyers a sliver of joy. There was this post where 9-year-old Frankie had this gumption to publish her own Cheer Up Weekly and delivered via bicycle and roller skates to 70 of her neighbors.
Wow.
Yeah, so these social determinants of health of creating those social support networks is really equally important. So the message here was to emphasize those creation of intergenerational relationships. And last but not least, the final aspect was that those playful invitations. So permissions to have fun, even in this world of uncertainty, and to allow for this exploration of wonder. So in line with the Rainbow and Bear Walks, people created little towns called Spoonville, and I think they took that cue from the UK. There is a local residence. There are many posts of people who dressed up as different characters, roller skating daily through their parks to the delight of exercising families. So Kevin Lynch said in The Image of the City that people should connect to the sense of what a setting can mean in terms of daily delight, or as a continuous anchor for their lives, or in its extension, the meaningfulness and richness of the world. So during COVID, I personally saw more people playfully walking, cycling, loving their local. And the uncertainty of COVID, and particularly through these rolling circuit breaker lockdowns here in Victoria, the challenge now is to keep up this momentum.
Vivian, did you get a sense in any of your observations of the role that councils or local governments might be playing in there? Did you pick up a prevalence of that or not?
No, absolutely. If I may also just talk about my hats here before I just, in light of my participation with the VLGA's Child-Friendly Cities and Communities. Yeah. CFCC, again, is just a collective of government and non-government spirited doers who are working alongside children to empower them to act as engaged citizens and share the perspectives of their communities. So each year, CFC works towards celebrating the annual Australian Children's Week that occurs during October. And so in particular, last year, the theme was, what can adults learn from children? And so what I'm starting to see within this group, what they, for example, Darebin City Council, in light of that first theme of reimagining space, they started taking a cue from the UK and playing out and implementing play streets. If we're looking at that second theme of reconnecting neighbors, for example, the Moreland City Council, they developed this project called Faces and Places, whereby primary school students connected with older and elderly residents. And so throughout the pandemic, acting as pen pals, they exchanged art through workbook activities. And so snippets from those workbooks were painted on the walls as murals in front of the Coburg Library for all to see. So what I was seeing from the councils, again, what Angela was talking about was those multi-agency partnerships and sort of working with children and young people to activate their spaces.
So who else could be involved in this space? Where else could partnerships be formed to provide those active play opportunities, do you think?
Oh, look, it's basically anybody who's vested with children and young people. So obviously schools are big organizations. You can also look, coming from public health, tapping into health facilities, child health care workers, hospitals and things like that. Schools is is an obvious choice, but really just tapping into the switched on people who are already working with children and young people.
Kathryn has rightly pointed out in the chat that Sharon Prinzi is with us today, the chair of the Child Friendly Cities and Communities Network, and we've had a chat with Sharon on VLGA Connect in the past as well, so great to have her here. Vivian, thank you for that. There's a couple more questions here, but I do want to make sure that we get in our audience questions, and I'm going to bring in Kathryn, who's been monitoring the chat, and I think we've got a few, Kathryn, have we not?
We have, Chris. I'm just wondering where to start. But look, just before I do go to the questions, I think it's quite interesting hearing the story that Angela described and some of the similar governance structures that we have available here in local government to perhaps pick up those initiatives that you described as part of your accreditation process. So I guess if we start with Angela, one of the questions that have come in is what did you find the most difficult aspect of the journey for you, for council going through that process?
I think that it would have been very easy for the city council to have just sought the accreditation, and given the volume of activity we do in the space, you know, my view is that we have engagement with children from the age of 3 up to the age of 18. So from the whole system point of view, there's a lot of interface naturally between councils and children. And so I think that it would have been very, very easy for the accreditation to simply be in the city council. To move from that to the partnership discussion, I'm struggling to describe what was difficult, and I think that's because the reality, Kathryn, is that my police commander, and he's retired now, was the biggest champion of children that I've ever come across, and there was never any doubt about whether Police Scotland for us and the local commander and division, there was never any debate around whether he would bring his organisation into this journey. I think that, you know, you could argue that that was quite a unique position, and, you know, I think for Police Scotland, you know, the Chief Constable would describe that they take a public health-led approach to policing. But I think that was a bold decision, and I think that had then a domino effect. So when we might have found it difficult to have persuaded other partners, I think that the uniqueness of Police Scotland taking such a position made the journey easier. So in that sense, there was no barrier to get the partnership. I think it was just, again, the political bit around saying to council leader, let's make this a partnership, not just a city council. And so, you know, if there's a credit to be achieved, let's share that together. But again, we didn't find that particularly difficult. I'm struggling to identify anything that was difficult. That probably the fundamentals, just never enough hours in the day to do everything you want to do, and to make sure that it wasn't just another pilot and initiative. So I think we were really focused on making sure that this would be embedded, and that there would then therefore be no risk of never achieving the accreditation going forward. So getting it embedded, and so I think initially we started as if it was an initiative, and I think that we felt that that was quite shallow. And I think then we all took stock and said, let's get this, you know, so I think we took a bit of time to reset it and then to make sure it was embedded. But probably the fundamental, like yourselves, never enough time, never enough resource. You could always have more time, you could always have more money. But I think we've just taken the view that we would kind of crack on with it. So I don't want that answer to sound as if this has been an easy journey. But I think that, again, I come back to the journey of trust. I think made what might have been some institutional barriers. They weren't in they just weren't there for us. So sorry, I haven't answered that in a negative, but I just think there were that spirit of leadership, trust, commitment has just meant we've moved, and the challenge has been more around saying, let's make sure this is embedded rather than kind of one-off. Kathryn, I hope that answers the question.
Look, I think it does, absolutely, Angela, and I think what you've described, that could be a challenge. And even if we look at the Victorian model, where we do have a state government as well as what you refer to as a national government, we I guess, where the importance of local government and those state-based agencies and stakeholders being able to work together and being on the same page in order to make any child-friendly initiatives really work. And I think what you've described is the importance of those stakeholders all being, you know, aligned on that journey. We do have a question from Councillor Seema Abdullah, who's from Shepparton, and she's asking you to give us an example of evidence backed up by testimony from children interested. Well, I guess what she's saying is that she'd be really interested to hear you talk about groups that you had and their input. Are you able to talk a little bit more about that?
Happy to. I mean, one example I would quote, again, through the rights respecting schools, council leader and myself were out visiting a school, and we were getting to see all the work they'd been doing around the school garden and so on. And just, you know, as kids do, this kind of sweet 6-year-old boy said to the council leader, you know, why do we have straws in all of our juice? It's just not good for the environment. And so, you know, out of the mouths of Babe. So the council leader said, well, I think we should follow this up, and why don't you come to the council chamber and let's have the conversation? And we've got 45 councillors. And so the little boy and the school formally wrote to the council, asking the council to reconsider its use of plastic straws. And these young folk came to the council chamber, and I'm sure your chambers are as dynamic as our chamber are, but you know, there was just a silence for these young children in the chamber, and they made a pretty impactful case for council to make the decision to remove the use of plastic straws right across. So we, as part of the evidence, so we had a normal report written by council officers, but as part of that we had the letter from the young children, and we had their attendance in the chamber, and council proceeded to make the decision to then therefore remove the use of straws. So I give that as way of an example around, I guess, the type of evidence. So, you know, the evidence was a visit from council leader and myself, that conversation leading to a letter that the young people wrote, then led to the committee report decision, and on video the recording of the young people there. So I think that, you know, that's the range of kind of evidence that you can have as part of this. I should say, as an aside, the 7-year-old also took the opportunity to say that his granny was struggling to get to the bingo because the buses had changed, and council leader had to say that wasn't quite in her gift to make that change. So, you know, he wasn't shy in using his voice. But I think it's that for us, and that's why the badge we went for was about decision making. it's the point that Liana's making. It's got to move away from just being tokenistic, isn't it? And you've got to be able to take it right up to the level of decision making you have within your control as a local authority. And we've started that. And part of our decision making action plan is around how we'll make sure that all committee reports and council reports are required to evidence the impact of children on the decision that council or committee are being asked to make. So that's the kind of example. We also had the Youth Parliament from Scottish Parliament did a piece of work again in a deprived community that had a big engagement piece with a load of young children about what they wanted from the city, and they created a charter and they created a big mural. And again, we were invited to be part of painting the mural. So that mural, for example, which is gigantic, is part of the evidence and the charter that the young people designed. And the first thing on the charter they want is for the city to love them. So that's the kind of evidence, it's a volume and a diversity on that badge for us in particular, showing the systems and processes you've got to enable the voice, and then what you've done with the voice and your decision and the changes that's taken place. But I think that as always, you want to capture the uniqueness of how children express themselves. So we don't want the evidence just to be a whole load of stuffy reports from officers. So we want to go with how children naturally communicate as well. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Angela, for that. Now I do have a question for Liana, which is from Deborah Wu. Deborah, I might ask you to ask the question if you wouldn't mind.
Sorry, I'm not on camera today, unfortunately, but I'm really interested in, Liana, if you could talk us through I guess the development of the Commission for Children and Young People in Victoria, and I guess what created that appetite for resourcing and allocating that body. And similarly, I'm interested in hearing from Angela about how that justification was made, because I know these things don't come cheap. And if Vivian has any insight from governments across the world that have done similar things as well, I'd be really interested to hear that.
Great question. And I'll try and give the bonsai version, but I think in part what I would say is that the history and origins of the Commission for Children and Young People in Victoria kind of helps explain why, although I take a very strong child rights focus, and so we as a whole commission do, actually my legislation, the kind of statute that establishes my role and the role of the Commission doesn't talk about rights at all. So in terms of the history of the Commission, it began with a very strong child safety focus, and a particular focus in the beginning around monitoring how government provided services to groups of children for whom the state had taken on a particular role. So kids involved in child protection, those in out-of-home care, and those in youth justice. So we had a particular, and still have, a role monitoring what government is doing with and for those children and young people. Quite on one view, a kind of narrow focus that has expanded over time. The other driver, or the other driver for an expanded range of functions and resources for the Commission has come more recently in the last 4 or 5 years. And that came again from a very strong child safety focus. So in Victoria, we had a parliamentary inquiry on sexual abuse of children in religious and other institutions. There's an inquiry underway in the UK, I know, because I gave evidence there a couple of years ago. And we then had the National Royal Commission on the same issues here. And so that recommended that the Commission for Children, or some like body, have particular functions. And as lots of the people who are certainly from local government in Victoria will know, we now play a role administering what are called child safe standards that really are about making sure all organisations that work with children have a very strong range of policies and systems and processes to prevent harm to children, but that also, importantly for me, have strategies to empower children and make sure they can participate. So we're starting to get some kind of rights-based framing in there. So those two kind of drivers were really what brought the Commission into being, and then has given us additional resourcing over time. when we look at then COVID, for example, and the impact of COVID and decisions of all levels of government about COVID and services in response to COVID, what we see is actually the impacts are much broader. They're much broader than just kids in out-of-home care. They're much broader than the approach that a church will take to keeping children safe there. And we have some capacity as a commission to have that broad mandate, but we're not necessarily resourced to do it. And we don't have the kind of strong legislative framework that we've heard about from Angela. So that's a good segue to you, Angela, maybe for you to kind of talk about some of the history and some of how that focus came about in Scotland.
I mean, I'll maybe just focus on local government and I guess our perspective around why we've got into this space in particular. And I think that there's a there's a uniqueness to Aberdeen economy in terms of an oil kind of capital, and an impression that the city streets are paved of gold. And I guess what we all now know in the modern time is that prosperous economies don't benefit everybody. And so when you looked at the history of Aberdeen, despite sort of significant prosperity, there were still families and children who were not gaining from all of that. And I think that made the city kind of look at the reality of its kind of economics, and that we had quite extremes. And some of the research shows that Aberdeen would have some extreme trends in the way that London does as well. So I think that economic narrative of the city heightened those extremes, and I guess some of the really poor outcomes, and in particular some of our attainment outcomes for children, because there was a pipeline of employment through oil and gas. Bizarrely, levels of attainment in the city historically have actually been kind of really low, and we all know that best start of life comes from having a fundamentally sort of strong education. So I think the economics, Chris, of Aberdeen has brought a focus to how all children haven't been gaining in the history, and I think that that's been front and centre of our political leaders, particularly our present leader, since her tenure, about making sure that all children could gain. And I think that's why there was a strong desire to make sure that we were progressing this agenda, not just as a local authority, but that we were doing it with partners as well. And I guess again, there's a fiscal reality for us, and I think a maturity around saying let's not have unintended consequences on services that are going to support children. And I know that in the chat, folk have been comparing and contrasting your duties in terms of children and adults. And of course, we're trying to square all of those things off. But from a preventative point of view, we fundamentally know that, if we can get upstream and focus on good outcomes for children, then that's going to serve not only those children and their families well, but it's going to serve the city well as well. So I guess there's been an economic push or an economic reality from the city's history. What we find as we've gone into COVID, that it's coincided again. I know that all cities are coping with the transition to net zero, but we've got an economy that historically has been based on fossil fuel. So not only do we have to transition our place environmentally, we've got to transition our economy as well. And again, we've got some pretty dire statistics that have been coming out about our level of unemployment notices that are taking place as part of that economic transition as well. So I guess that's been a real reality around the need to protect children. And I think that's kind of driven us at a local level. Chris, I'm not sure if I've answered the
No, that's
question.
good. Thank you. I'm mindful of time. Believe it or not, we're running out of time. This has just flown. I did promise Vivian an opportunity to ask you a question, Angela, and I wonder, Vivian, if that question had been answered yet, or you'd like to pose that of Angela.
The Scottish government is one of several governments that's advocating Article 31, the rights to play, through its governmental manifesto and strategy for play. So I just wanted to know how is Aberdeen promoting this?
And you're absolutely right. The Scottish Government launched a national play strategy, and on the back of that as a local system, we then developed our own city play strategy and a programme, a 3-year programme, which we have implemented and delivered, which has been great. That programme's included a range of things, Vivian, so play in schools, play out of school, in clubs, communities, large-scale spring and summer play programmes in local neighbourhoods, play parks. Again, we've invested significantly. We're all really pleased that we created a Woodlands Explorer play scheme, particularly for children with additional support needs. We focused on play sessions with children that were living on our Gypsy Traveller community as well. Again, under Scottish Government, there's been a big expansion of early learning and childcare across Scotland. As part of that, we're opening 2 outdoor nurseries, and given Scottish weather, in particular Aberdeen weather, we're taking a bit of a gamble with that. But again, it's continuing the commitment to learning through play and doing that through outdoor spaces as well. So we're at a point, Vivian, where we've delivered our programme and we've incorporated all of that into BAU. We continue to deliver on the early years commitment. Through COVID, there's been a big, again, over the summer period, there's a big kind of programme of Summer of Fun, which lovely, from a really lovely perspective. We did big engagement with children about what they wanted over the summer. Of course, great, they all said they didn't want any technology. They wanted to just be out running about. So we've had a really big programme. Inevitably, it's been affected by COVID because we're having some isolation that's going on, but there's been a big programme that's run, £500,000 that's been invested in that. But we would ordinarily, Vivian, run kind of big programmes over the summer holidays and free school meals over the summer holidays, because again, we know that the cost of summer holidays is not cheap for a family. So we've been doing that for a number of years. So play is really central to all of this. And again, I think like I'm sure all of you, we're just thinking in a post-pandemic world, where are going to be the ongoing deficits? And just building up Liana's point, particularly for us, what our data is revealing is that the speech ability, the language and speech ability of children, in particular young children, and also what we've picked up as children that are in single parent families. So we're trying to identify those deficits that have been created and think about what will be required post-pandemic. And I certainly think play, children are going to need to be compensated for what's been stolen from their childhood. So post the summer programme, which has been huge to get up and running, I think we will reflect on what our play agenda is going forward. But there's been a considerable investment. Again, happy to share the details of the programme if any colleagues were interested.
Kathryn, do we have time for 1 or 2 more questions perhaps before we wrap up?
I think we've got time for another question, and this relates to what Angela was just talking about, and also Vivian's discussion about the importance of play. And a question's come in from one of the audience about those members of the community, those children in the community and young people who were already vulnerable prior to COVID, and have we ensured that we've captured them, in the responses and the initiatives, and whether, Vivian, you've seen any particular evidence of how jurisdictions have not only identified those children more vulnerable as a result of COVID, but made sure that those already identified as vulnerable have been, picked up and looked after.
I just could speak generally that COVID has highlighted the inequities prevalent among children, childhood, and accesses to services. But if I can handball it to Liana, because I think she has a better grasp of that concept.
Thanks, Vivian, and I agree. In fact, I think the pandemic, and I'm sure this is not just a Victorian or Australian experience, hasn't just highlighted inequality; it's absolutely widened it. No question at all. When we talk to children and young people about how they were experiencing things last year, lots were struggling with school, for example, but it was children and young people in crowded families and families that didn't have access to IT, or even if they got the laptop from the school. Their parents didn't know how to help them to use it. The children with disability. There's no question that those who are already experiencing some barriers absolutely have been the hardest hit in a whole range of ways. I certainly last year came across some really good local examples of, for example, schools working together with perhaps some local government services, perhaps some maternal child health services, with child and family services, and sharing information, trying to find ways to share information about which families might need particular support, which children might be particularly at risk, and what those supports could look like. My concern was those were very, very ad hoc. They were very dependent on individuals and existing good relationships and collaborations. And we know that we don't always do that particularly well. And what I really wanted to see then and still is that actually we systematize that. So that collaboration and information sharing and working together to identify which are the families that need some more support and how do we provide it. That's, I think, whenever we go into a lockdown process, and indeed when we're not in one, that's what I think we need to see more and more of. And I saw some great examples of it. But not nearly enough. So in fact, I think the questions is really well put, because I think for many children, not those only who are living with significant issues at home or in significant poverty, but certainly including them, I think the kind of positive benefits of time with family and more time outside playing, I think for lots of children, that wasn't the reality in Victoria last year.
Thank you, Liana. I think we're going to have to call it a day there, as we're getting into the evening here in Australia and we're cutting into the workday in the UK and Ireland. Kathryn, before I thank the panel, any final comments from you?
Thank you, Chris, for that. And look, I'd just like to thank the panel and also the audience for your participation and for putting forward some questions and comments. And I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of those. It does strike me, though, and just reinforce what we already know, all of us in the room, is the critically important role that local government plays in our communities. And if anything, I think COVID and this concept of the fact that we are all living and working in our communities more than we have ever done before, whether that means we're working from home remotely. Perhaps it's almost an opportunity for the local government sector to rethink the way it has been looking at its municipal community health and wellbeing planning process, its inclusion and diversity processes, its planning processes, because if this pandemic continues, and then the communities need to have within them those structures that Liana has spoken about. So I look forward, and we could talk about this. It's really interesting. And what does that mean for the different other levels of government, particularly here in Australia? But on that note, I will hand back to Chris and ask you to wrap up. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. We've covered a lot of ground this evening, and I think we could have probably gone for another hour or so. I certainly didn't get through the list of questions I had, but we certainly were able to get in some of the audience questions, which was great. Now, some are asking about access to a recording. Yes, there will be a recording of this session made available. There's quite a few people who registered that couldn't join us live that do that deliberately to be able to see the recording back. So all registrants will receive a link to that once it's ready in a day or so. So that just leaves me to thank, in order, Angela Scott, CEO of Aberdeen City Council. That's been fabulous. You've put some work into thinking about what to present tonight, Angela, and we really appreciate it. Thank you very much. It was great to meet you.
Thank you, Chris. And I will, I noticed in the chat some folk asking for a bit more information, so I'll send them through to you and you can share them with colleagues. But thank you for the opportunity to join you.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. Liana Buchannan, great to see you again, and thank you for sharing your insights with us, the Commissioner for Children and Young People in Victoria, and we hope to see you again soon.
I'm sure you will, and thanks, Chris, Kathryn, and others for the focus on children. Appreciate it.
And Dr. Vivian Romero from Central Queensland University for sharing your work with us as well. And I'm sure people found that very interesting, and there would be opportunities to catch up with the work that you're doing too, I'm sure, Vivian.
Thank you all, and go out and be safe.
Indeed. And to Kathryn and the VLGA team, thank you all for your support for the event. And that just leaves me to thank the audience, most of whom stayed for the whole thing this evening, which I think is always a good sign that the topic is resonating. So thank you all. We look forward to seeing you again for another global panel session very soon. Thank you to LGiU for their involvement in this session, as well as the VLGA. Good night to everyone in Australia, and have a great day in the UK and Ireland. Bye for now.